What does a man say when the very foundation of his absolute power, the sacred covenant he made with his nation, shatters right above his head in broad daylight? March 6, 1944, 6 miles above the capital of the Third Reich, a second lieutenant named Robert Johnson felt the violent shudder of his B-17 flying fortress as flak, the German anti-aircraft artillery, erupted with brutal proximity, peppering the aluminum fuselage with razor-sharp shrapnel. Below the breaks in the heavy smoke lay the city of Berlin, spread out in the crystalline afternoon light, every street and monumental building tragically visible, perfectly clear. In a fortified bunker or command post somewhere beneath that site, Adolf Hitler, the Führer, received the horrifying, unavoidable intelligence. American heavy bombers, the despised arsenal of democracy, were directly over his capital, and they were there in broad daylight for the second time in 72 hours. This realization, according to those present, plunged the dictator into a white-hot, incredulous rage, a refusal to believe that the world he had promised, a world where the Reich's capital was untouchable, was collapsing. The path to this singular moment of devastating clarity, with over 600 American bombers executing their mission against the heart of the regime, was not a sudden turn of events, but a 4-year accumulation of broken promises and accumulating inescapable evidence that Germany's air defenses were a crumbling illusion. The entire premise of the Third Reich's military strategy, its very Weltanschauung, had been built upon a boast, a fatal piece of arrogance uttered 5 years earlier, in August 1939, by the man entrusted with the Reich's air superiority, Hermann Göring. Standing before a vast crowd in the crucial Ruhr industrial region, Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and Reichsmarschall, his chest heavy with an obscene array of medals, declared a promise that would define his legacy and haunt the Third Reich. If enemy bombers reached the Ruhr, he proclaimed with absolute confidence, "You can call me Mayor." Mayor, a common Jewish surname, was a calculated, vicious insult, a boast staking Göring's entire reputation, his very name, on the absolute impossibility of any enemy aircraft penetrating German airspace. Hitler had not merely accepted this promise, he had internalized it, weaving this certainty into the very fabric of his global strategy, believing Göring implicitly because the Luftwaffe had demonstrated a terrifying, unstoppable superiority, having swept through Poland, terrorized Rotterdam, and brought Britain to its knees during the savage, nightmarish Blitz. The logic was indisputable in the minds of the Nazi leadership. German fighter aircraft were technically superior. German tactics were proven in the crucible of early war victories, and German air defenses were therefore axiomatically impenetrable. Thus, when Göring guaranteed that no hostile bomber would ever reach Berlin, Hitler structured his entire war plan around this absolute certainty, diverting resources and attention elsewhere, fundamentally underestimating the tenacious industrial and moral capacity of his enemies. The first, almost insignificant, cracks in this towering edifice of denial appeared a year later. In August 1940, when British Royal Air Force, RAF bombers, relying on the cover of darkness, managed to reach Berlin at night. Hitler's response was not introspection or a strategic review, but immediate, incandescent fury directed outward, a primal urge for vengeance. "If they attack our cities," he publicly announced in a terrifying declaration, "we will raze theirs to the ground." The ensuing blitz against London was his answer, a massive, vengeful demonstration of perceived German air power intended not merely to punish, but to break the British will and force a preemptive surrender. For the Berliners, the wail of air raid sirens was framed as a temporary, negligible aberration, a momentary nuisance that the omnipotent Luftwaffe would soon and efficiently eliminate. But the RAF did not stop. They kept coming relentlessly through 1941, 1942, and 1943, finding Berlin in the oppressive cloak of darkness. And with each passing year, the intensity and weight of the raids grew exponentially. The turning point, the formal beginning of the end of the Luftwaffe's credibility, arrived on November 18, 1943, marking the start of what RAF Bomber Command formally designated as the Battle of Berlin, a sustained, brutal campaign that would dispatch over 400 heavy bombers against the city night after night. By March 1944, the relentless nocturnal assault had resulted in 16 major raids on the capital, a catastrophic tally that had killed approximately 10,000 Berliners and resulted in the destruction or major damage of over 1.5 million dwellings across the city. The destruction became so profound, so psychologically unbearable, that Hitler abruptly ceased visiting any bombed German city after 1943. Albert Speer, his armaments minister, later documented in his memoirs that the Führer was incapable of facing the devastating reality of the destruction, unable to meet the eyes of the citizens who had lost everything despite his hollow, increasingly worthless promises of absolute protection. Instead of confronting reality, Hitler retreated deep into his headquarters, a progressively isolated figure surrounded by an elaborate network of maps and reports that he increasingly chose to refuse to believe, choosing delusion over accountability. The night raids were undeniably terrible, a constant gnawing source of fear, but night bombing possessed a degree of necessary imprecision, a scattershot effect that Hitler's propaganda machine could still manage and frame. The RAF, forced to drop their payloads through thick cloud and heavy smoke, primarily struck residential areas, generating massive firestorms but rarely achieving the pinpoint destruction of specific critical factories or essential infrastructure with the desired military precision. The propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels could work with this ambiguity, successfully portraying the British bombers as barbaric instruments of terror against civilians, while simultaneously promising an overwhelming future German retaliation. But then came the Americans, and everything changed. American bombers were categorically different because the United States Army Air Forces adhered to a deeply held, almost doctrinal belief in daylight precision bombing, a concept radically different from the British nighttime area bombing campaign. The formidable B-17 flying fortresses and the robust B-24 Liberators flew in massive, dense formations, operating in broad daylight, heavily protected by increasingly sophisticated, multi-layered defensive armament, and eventually escorted by long-range fighter aircraft. Their mission was explicitly clear: to aim for specific, high-value strategic targets, including ball-bearing factories, key aircraft assembly plants, vital synthetic oil refineries, and strategic marshalling yards. They came when the weather offered the requisite clarity to visually acquire their targets, which tragically meant that the citizens of Berlin could also see them, an inescapable, humiliating spectacle. They appeared as silver specks at extremely high altitudes, leaving behind unmistakable white contrails etched across the sky, a visible, tangible symbol of the Luftwaffe's failure. For Adolf Hitler, this was categorically and psychologically different from the night raids. This was the American military-industrial complex, the very arsenal of democracy he had contemptuously dismissed as utterly incapable of projecting meaningful power across the vast Atlantic, flying unimpeded over his very capital in the clear, humiliating light of day. They flew where German citizens could actively watch them, count them, and witness with their own eyes the undeniable truth that the once vaunted Luftwaffe could not, would not, or simply could no longer stop them. The psychological warfare began in earnest on March 4, 1944, when the first American bombs fell directly on Berlin. Approximately 730 B-17s and B-24s from the 8th Air Force, now accompanied by the revolutionary P-51 Mustang fighters equipped with drop tanks that finally provided them with the necessary range to reach the capital and return safely, struck targets across the city in the bright afternoon light. German fighter squadrons rose in desperation to meet the intruders, and the flak batteries fired until their barrels glowed crimson hot. But the massive American formations pressed through the defensive fire, efficiently dropped their bombs, and a vast majority of them successfully flew home. Just 2 days later, they returned. 660 heavy bombers, once again in daylight, once again hitting Berlin while the sun was still high in the sky, a deliberate psychological continuation of the assault. Lieutenant Johnson was a small part of that massive, terrifying spectacle, piloting one of those B-17s, watching the flak bursts blossom around his aircraft, observing the desperate, futile dives of German fighters through the bomber formations, and feeling the jarring shake of the aircraft as the deadly payloads released from the bay below. On the ground, Berliners who had endured years of terrifying night raids now stood silently and watched the American formations overhead in the clear afternoon light. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Night bombing had been terrifying, yes, but it remained largely invisible, a destructive force that happened under the cloak of darkness and smoke, lending itself to Goebbels' easy manipulation. Daylight raids, however, were absolutely undeniable, a truth you could see, you could count, and you could watch the contrails vanish into the western sky, knowing with absolute horrifying certainty that the once invincible German air defenses had failed, publicly and irrefutably. The Führer, sequestered deep within his headquarters, received the reports which filtered through the self-serving memoirs and testimonies of the surviving witnesses. But the core of his reaction was utterly consistent. It was a catastrophic mixture of uncontrollable rage, outright disbelief, and a desperate, frantic search for a scapegoat, someone, anyone, to blame for the unthinkable breach of his sacred promise. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Hitler initially accused his own intelligence services of deliberately and maliciously exaggerating the American bomber numbers. This simply could not be accurate, he raged. The Americans, he insisted, did not possess this many heavy bombers stationed in England. They could not possibly have built this many aircraft so quickly. Therefore, the reports had to be inflated, insidious, defeatist propaganda deliberately fabricated from within his own military ranks. When presented with overwhelming, undeniable evidence, including crystal-clear reconnaissance photographs and consolidated reports from multiple, independent sources, Hitler's towering fury finally pivoted, turning with devastating force toward the Luftwaffe itself. Where were the fighters? He screamed, demanding to know. Why weren't the flak batteries effective enough to stop them? His rage focused on the individual who had guaranteed the city's safety. Hermann Göring, the man who had promised Berlin would never be bombed, had publicly allowed American aircraft to fly unmolested over the capital in broad daylight. Göring, once Hitler's designated and powerful successor, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, had rapidly and humiliatingly devolved into a pathetic figure of ridicule. His escalating morphine addiction was a known, open secret among the high command. His weight had ballooned to an unhealthy degree, and his increasingly fantastic, disconnected promises about revolutionary new aircraft and decisive wonder weapons were now met with deep, corrosive skepticism, even within the inner hierarchy of the Nazi Party. Yet Hitler had built too much of his strategic certainty around Göring's early, comforting assurances to simply abandon him. Not yet. Instead, the Führer's scattered, unpredictable rage was now cast across the entire Luftwaffe command structure, a systemic, debilitating indictment. General Adolf Hitler, the highly respected commander of the German fighter forces, later vividly described the nightmarish meetings where Hitler absolutely refused to accept the concrete, verifiable reality of the air war. When Gallen dutifully reported that German fighters were massively outnumbered, technically outperformed by the superior American P-51s, and critically running out of irreplaceable, experienced pilots, Hitler instantly and reflexively accused him of defeatism. When Galland attempted to explain the brutal mathematics that German aircraft production, though high, simply could not keep pace with the catastrophic losses, Hitler dismissed him, violently pointing to Speer's meticulously prepared statistics that did indeed show increased production, and demanded to know why these newly produced aircraft were not currently airborne, actively stopping the ubiquitous, streaming bombers. The gap between Hitler's deeply ingrained absolute understanding of the air war and the unforgiving, quantifiable reality had become a massive, impassable chasm. Speer's production numbers were technically entirely real. German factories were producing more aircraft than they ever had before, miraculously defying the massive bombing campaign. However, those newly built aircraft were being systematically destroyed in combat faster than the factories could possibly deliver them to the operational units. Experienced pilots, the invaluable few, were being killed or injured at a rate far exceeding the capacity of the meager training programs to produce competent replacements. Moreover, the essential fuel required to fly the aircraft, especially the synthetic oil, was becoming increasingly scarce as American bombers systematically and methodically executed a devastating campaign against the critical oil plants. Hitler's only response to these inescapable, quantifiable realities was to retreat even further into a deep, desperate fantasy about imminent, overwhelming retaliation. He began speaking obsessively and frequently about the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets, then under development, miracle weapons he believed would wreak unprecedented destruction on London and force Britain out of the war entirely. He promised that revolutionary new jet fighters would soon sweep the American bombers completely from German skies. He stubbornly insisted that the relentless Allied bombing campaign would utterly break Allied morale long before it could ever break the resolve of the German populace, believing that the Western powers would be forced to sue for peace once they fully understood the astronomical cost of their aerial offensive. But by March 1944, with American heavy bombers visible over Berlin in broad daylight, and RAF bombers returning with devastating consistency each night, Hitler's once powerful promises rang hollow, their sound echoing feebly even among the most deeply ingrained, true believers in the Nazi cause. The ultimate key to the psychological and strategic collapse was the realization of the round-the-clock bombing. The RAF's night raids, as horrific as they were, had unintentionally granted German workers the vital daylight hours required to clear the rubble, attempt to restore critical utilities, and crucially, maintain some semblance of industrial production. The new American daylight raids violently eliminated this necessary recovery time. Suddenly, Berlin was not merely under attack. It was under constant, relentless siege, 24 hours a day. Air raid sirens wailed with exhausting frequency at both afternoon and midnight. Workers were now forced to spend their crucial working hours cowering in crowded shelters instead of actively operating the machinery in the factories. The psychological toll became immense, eroding the national will from within. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, meticulously recorded in his private diary the immense challenge of attempting to maintain even a facade of morale within Berlin during this brutal period. His diary entries from March 1944 paint a grim picture, describing a population utterly exhausted by the constant alerts, growing deeply skeptical of all official assurances, and openly questioning why the promised mighty Luftwaffe was completely incapable of stopping the bombers. Goebbels, who had built his entire formidable career on the absolute control of information, suddenly found himself powerless, unable to credibly deny what the Berliners could see with their own eyes. The unstoppable contrails, the silver specks, the falling destruction. Hitler's reaction to Goebbels' increasingly dire reports was profoundly telling of his deep-seated denial. Rather than addressing the brutal reality of the German air defense failures, the Führer obsessively demanded more and more propaganda promoting German retaliation. He specifically wanted newsreels showing the V-weapons in advanced development, demanding speeches that promised these devastating German wonder weapons would soon utterly devastate Allied cities. His ultimate objective was to violently shift the national narrative away from the deeply humiliating reality of German vulnerability toward the fantasy of imminent German vengeance. This pattern of psychological denial and fantastical promise became Hitler's rigid operating procedure throughout the final, brutal year of the air war. Confronted with tangible evidence of crippling German weakness, he instantly promised future, overwhelming strength. Told about massive aircraft losses, he spoke only of advanced jet fighters rapidly nearing development. Informed about the irreplaceable pilot casualties, he referenced massive training programs that he claimed would magically produce superior aviators. Presented with the undeniable reality of American bombers flying freely over Berlin, he violently threatened retaliation so devastating that the Allies would instantly regret ever beginning their bombing campaign. Yet the threats were empty, increasingly understood as nothing more than bluster, and in a terrifying internal shift, Hitler himself seemed to know it. Speer later wrote hauntingly about a crucial meeting in March 1944, held shortly after the first wave of American daylight raids on Berlin, where Hitler sat for long, unnerving periods in complete silence, merely staring blankly at the maps, refusing to respond to any questions or engage in discussion. The Führer, the man who had once utterly dominated every conversation, who could talk for hours with tireless confidence about strategy, tactics, and the inevitable German victory, was visibly retreating into an internal silence, a shell of his former, energetic self. This chilling silence was arguably far more disturbing to the high command than his previous violent rages. His fury at the Luftwaffe, his frenzied accusations of defeatism, his desperate promises of retaliation, these were fundamentally still active responses, pathological attempts to forcefully impose his will onto an uncooperative reality. The deepening silence, however, suggested something far worse, a profound growing awareness that reality was now utterly beyond his control, that the vast, impossible promises could never be kept, and that the German air defenses had demonstrably failed and would continue to fail permanently. The raids, now an undeniable fact of life, continued with ruthless consistency. On March 22, 1944, American bombers returned to Berlin, over 700 heavy bombers hitting the city again in daylight. 2 days later, on March 24th, over 800 bombers struck. The punishing pattern continued relentlessly through the entire spring, with the Americans and British taking turns, ensuring Berlin was under constant, unending attack. German fighters still rose, the flak battery still fired until exhaustion, but the bombers kept coming, an unstoppable flow. In his deep retreat from reality, Hitler simply stopped asking for detailed reports about the raids. According to Speer, the Führer specifically didn't want to hear casualty figures or damage assessments. He would issue arbitrary orders for drastically increased fighter production, demand completely unrealistic progress reports on jet aircraft development, and insist that the V-weapons campaign be wildly accelerated. But he flatly refused to discuss the existential reality of what was actually happening over the capital of the Reich. This absolute comprehensive denial even extended catastrophically into his critical military planning. In high-level meetings discussing the desperate Eastern Front or the anticipated Allied invasion of France, Hitler would frequently reference German air superiority as if it were still a present and powerful reality. He would plan complex operations that fundamentally required air cover the completely depleted Luftwaffe could no longer possibly provide. He would dismiss legitimate concerns about overwhelming Allied air power with vague, utterly baseless assurances that the situation would somehow soon change. The generals who had served Hitler loyally for years watched this increasing, dangerous disconnect with palpable, growing alarm. Some, like General Gallen, attempted in vain to force Hitler to confront the reality with detailed, undeniable reports and tangible evidence. Others, having learned the futility of such efforts, simply learned to work around the Führer's profound delusions, creating secret operational plans that accurately accounted for the crippling reality of Allied air superiority, while maintaining the transparent pretense in Hitler's presence that German fighters still controlled the skies. The unrelenting American daylight raids and the persistent RAF night raids continued their dual, devastating campaign throughout 1944 and deep into 1945. Berlin was subjected to over 300 bombing raids during the war, with the heaviest and most destructive attacks occurring after the Americans fully joined the strategic campaign. By the war's inevitable end, approximately 50,000 Berliners had been tragically killed by the bombs, and roughly half of the city's once grand buildings were either severely damaged or completely destroyed. Yet the physical destruction, however terrible and widespread, was not the most significant or lasting impact of the bombing campaign on the dictator himself. The psychological effect, the undeniable, visible evidence that his most sacred promises were blatant lies and that his absolute power was demonstrably failing, may have ultimately been far more devastating to the man than the physical destruction of the bombs themselves. Hitler had meticulously built his entire brutal regime on a foundation of absolute certainty, on the fundamental promise that he alone possessed the will and vision to restore German greatness, that his personal iron will would effortlessly overcome any obstacle, and that unwavering belief in the Führer would inherently guarantee victory. The inescapable sight of those American bombers sailing effortlessly over Berlin in broad daylight, remaining untouchable despite every desperate measure the Luftwaffe could throw against them, utterly shattered that certainty. Göring's arrogant promise that Berlin would never be bombed had now been broken thousands of times. Hitler's confident assurance that the mighty Luftwaffe would protect the German cities was revealed to be a mere fantasy. The entire narrative of German air superiority, so central and vital to the Nazi propaganda machine, collapsed completely under the overwhelming weight of observable, physical reality. And Hitler, confronted with this ultimate, inescapable failure, could only react with escalating rage, deepening denial, and a final, desperate retreat into the empty promises of wonder weapons that he hoped would somehow magically reverse the irreversible course of the war. He never once visited Berlin during the peak of the heavy raids of 1944 and 1945. He never toured the bombed-out districts or met with the suffering survivors. Instead, he remained morbidly secluded in his bunker, perpetually surrounded by maps that depicted a powerful Germany that no longer factually existed, endlessly planning campaigns that required non-existent air support, and fruitlessly promising a victory that was mathematically and strategically impossible. The very last American daylight raid on Berlin occurred on April 20th, 1945, a grimly symbolic day, Hitler's 56th birthday. Approximately 600 B-17s bombed the city, while Soviet forces were already fighting their way into the suburbs. 10 days later, Adolf Hitler was dead by his own hand, deep within his bunker beneath the ruins of the burning capital. What did Hitler actually say when he learned American bombers were over Berlin, day and night? According to those who were there until the end, he said many things: that the reports were malicious exaggerations, that the Luftwaffe Command was defeatist and incompetent, that overwhelming retaliation was imminent, that the wonder weapons would inevitably turn the tide, and that the pure German will would ultimately prevail. But beneath all the furious words was a profound, spreading silence, a rapidly growing void where his absolute certainty had once resided, an awareness that he could not admit even to himself. The war was definitively lost. His powerful promises were irretrievably broken, and the visible bombers overhead were final, incontrovertible proof of his comprehensive failure. The round-the-clock bombing of Berlin was not merely a military campaign. It was a daily, visible, and psychological demonstration that Hitler's absolute power had limits. It was a proof that his will, for all its vaunted strength, could not stop the unstoppable force of American industrial capacity or British determination. The Third Reich, which he had megalomaniacally promised would last 1,000 years, was demonstrably crumbling after a mere 12. Every bomber that flew over Berlin in daylight was a damning piece of evidence that Göring's promises were lies and Hitler's assurances were pure fantasy. And Hitler, who had built his entire reign on the foundational power of his word, on the chilling certainty of his vision, on the false inevitability of German victory, had no coherent response left to offer but rage, denial, and silence. The bombers kept coming, day and night, and all of Hitler's legendary fury could not stop them. This perhaps was the campaign's most devastating impact. Not the physical destruction, but the crushing psychological reality that Hitler's will, for all his boastful talk of triumph through mere belief, was ultimately powerless against the concrete reality overhead. The Americans and British did not just bomb Berlin, they bombed the very myth of Hitler's strategic invincibility, and they did it in daylight where everyone could see. The constant, round-the-clock bombing of Berlin was described as destroying the myth of Hitler's invincibility more than the city itself. In a war defined by ideology, do you think the psychological defeat, seeing the failure overhead, was ultimately more important than the physical destruction in bringing about the end of the Third Reich? Let us know your analysis in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.